A silence falls over the bustling Galactic Council courtroom as Marcus Reed, the human ambassador, takes his place at the defendant's table. Alien eyes from across the galaxy scrutinize him, filled with a mix of dread, animosity, and morbid fascination. They all know what happened during the Orion Civil War, what all humans were involved in, and now the fate of humanity is in the balance. The galaxy will decide if mankind should be imprisoned like dangerous animals to prevent another disaster. Reed's gaze remains unwavering as Judge Thorne, the imposing Orion arbiter, calls the court to order. The human ambassador's expression reveals no emotion even as Thorne outlines the purpose of the trial, to determine the future role of humanity in galactic affairs. A not guilty verdict could unleash humanity's potential and usher in a new era of cooperation, but a guilty verdict would leave mankind diminished, their warriors forever barred from the stars. The prosecuting attorney, a spindly Arctan named Velair, activates a holographic projector and begins to methodically build the case against humanity. Graphs and video clips illustrate humanity's rapid technological advancement following first contact, unchecked expansion into resource-rich frontier worlds, and escalating tensions with the Orion hegemony and their tyrannical leader, Call. This all led to the pivotal moment when civil war broke out on the Orion homeworld and Call began forcibly recruiting human colonists into military service. Reed listens stoically as Velair describes how the Orion High Command, confident in their perceived superiority, attempted to exploit humanity's inherent ferocity. They pushed human conscripts to their limits in a futile effort to crush the rebels with expendable shock troops. This strategy backfired catastrophically when the Orion lines were breached and their enslaved soldiers turned against them. Humanity unleashed chaos upon the Orions. The courtroom fills with gasps and murmurs as graphic combat footage plays on the projector. Human forces, led by a younger Marcus Reed, storm Orion fortifications with brutal efficiency, moving with deadly precision. Alien defenders are blasted, stabbed, crushed, and shattered, their formations dissolving into bloody fragments. This is no ordinary uprising. It is a slaughter. As the video ends, a grim silence settles over the courtroom. Velair gestures towards Reed, his voice laced with moral outrage. He accuses Marcus Reed and his team of obliterating an entire civilization in revenge, branding humanity as a dangerous plague and a threat to galactic peace. He urges the Council to permanently restrain the human military to prevent further devastation. When Velair's closing statements conclude, Reed finally meets Judge Thorne's gaze. His eyes are steely, his jaw set in defiance. There will be no apologies, no pleas for mercy, only the stark truth of what happens when humanity is cornered. Reed stands ready to fight for humanity's right to defend itself, and if the Council rules against them, the galaxy will soon discover the true cost of confining a wolf. As the court adjourns for the day, tension is palpable. The galactic media swarm around the human delegation, thrusting microphones and cameras in their faces, eager for a soundbite. Yet, Reed and his team remain composed, navigating through the crowd with unwavering resolve. In the shadows of the council chamber, General Zara watches the proceedings with narrowed eyes. Petro's testimony has reopened old wounds, dredging up memories of the Orion War that Zara had tried to forget. The Orion's mandibles twitch with barely contained rage as he recalls the humiliation of being outmatched by humans. The following day, the trial resumes with renewed intensity. The defense calls forward a series of human veterans, each sharing their own harrowing stories of survival and sacrifice under Orion oppression. A once naive colonist recounts the horror of losing her family to rebel artillery fire. Another former conscript, his face marked by scars, describes holding off an entire enemy platoon with nothing but a makeshift spear. Through their stories, a common thread emerges, the unbreakable bond forged through adversity. The courtroom buzzed with renewed energy as the second day of the trial commenced. Judge Thorne's gavel struck the sound block, calling the court to order once more. The gallery was packed with representatives from various star systems, their eyes locked on the proceedings. The air was thick with anticipation, the previous day's drama still echoing in their minds. Marcus Reed sat at the defense table, his expression resolute. His team of legal experts and advisors flanked him, their faces a mix of worry and determination. Reed had known the stakes were high, but the stories of suffering and sacrifice from his fellow humans had ignited a fierce resolve within him. He was ready to fight not just for humanity's survival, but for its dignity. The defense had called for a recess to prepare their next witness. The spotlight now turned to a veteran of the Orion War, Lieutenant Ava Chun, who stood as a testament to humanity's resilience. She was a seasoned soldier with a calm demeanor, her uniform adorned with the medals of valor earned in the crucible of battle. As Ava took the stand, she glanced briefly at Reed, her eyes filled with a mix of admiration and determination. She began her testimony with a clear, steady voice, recounting her experiences as a young officer thrust into the chaos of the Orion conflict. "I joined the fight when I was barely 20, Ava began, her gaze steady. At first, it was about survival, but as the war dragged on, it became something more. It became about protecting those who couldn't protect themselves." She described her first encounter with the Orion forces, a brutal skirmish on a resource-rich colony world. The Orions had already established a stronghold. We were tasked with retaking the planet, but the odds were stacked against us. We were outnumbered, outgunned, and surrounded. Yet, we fought with everything we had. Her recounting painted a vivid picture of the dire situation. She spoke of the sheer determination of her fellow soldiers, their willingness to sacrifice everything for their comrades and for the people they had sworn to protect. Her voice wavered slightly as she recounted the loss of her own squad members, each one a beloved friend and fellow warrior. "We faced the Orions with nothing but our courage and a few makeshift weapons," Ava continued. "In the end, we managed to push them back, but not without paying a heavy price. Many of us were wounded, and too many didn't make it. But it was in that crucible of adversity that we forged bonds that could never be broken." As she concluded her testimony, Ava's eyes met those of Judge Thorne and the council members. Her words had painted a picture of humanity not as a threat, but as a people who had been forced into a brutal conflict driven by an unbreakable bond and a will to survive. The courtroom was silent, the gravity of her words sinking in. The Arcten prosecutor, Velayer, stood to cross-examine her, his eyes sharp and calculating. "Lieutenant Chun," Velayer began, "you speak of courage and sacrifice, but does not this very courage also lead to aggression? Your forces, despite being outnumbered, inflicted significant casualties upon the Orion defenders. How do you reconcile this with the claims of a just cause?" Ava's eyes flashed with resolve. "Our aggression was not born out of malice, but out of necessity. The Orions sought to enslave us and others. We fought not to conquer, but to defend our homes and our lives. There is a difference between aggression for dominance and aggression for survival." Velayer's questions grew more pointed, but Ava remained composed, her responses clear and unwavering. She had come to court not only to defend her actions, but to demonstrate the humanity's unyielding spirit. With Ava Chin's testimony concluded, the courtroom buzzed again, but this time with a more contemplative energy. The defense had made a strong case, showcasing the human will to fight not just for survival, but for a higher purpose. As the day ended, Marcus Reed and his team took a moment to regroup. Reed's face was set in a grim determination. The next witness would be critical, an Orion survivor who had been caught in the crossfire and had been living in the aftermath of the war. In the dimly lit corridors of the court, General Zara watched with a keen eye, his frustration evident. The testimony of Ava Chun had only intensified his resolve. He could see the shifting tides, the growing empathy for humanity's plight. The general's mind churned with strategies and counterarguments, knowing that the upcoming testimony would be crucial in shaping the council's final decision. As the legal battle continued, both sides prepared for the next phase of the trial. The stakes were higher than ever, and the future of humanity hung in the balance. The courtroom was quieter than usual as the third day of the trial began. The anticipation was palpable, with every seat filled and every eye fixed on the central figure in the courtroom. The atmosphere was charged with tension, a mixture of hope and apprehension hanging in the air. Marcus Reed and his defense team were ready for their next crucial witness. The previous testimonies had begun to sway some perceptions, but the upcoming witness was expected to be a game-changer. Today, They would hear from an Orion survivor, someone who had lived through the conflict and its aftermath, and whose perspective could bridge the gap between the warring sides. As the court convened, Judge Thorne's gavel struck, and the proceedings resumed. The Arctan prosecutor, Velayer, was already at his seat, his expression inscrutable. The defense team, on the other hand, appeared focused and determined, ready to present their next witness. The door to the witness stand opened, and a tall, solemn Orion entered the room. His name was Call, a middle-aged Orion with a deep scar running across his right cheek, a remnant of the conflict that had shaped his life. He walked with a deliberate, measured pace, and his presence commanded immediate respect. Call took his place at the witness stand and was sworn in. The courtroom remained silent as he began his testimony, his voice carrying a deep, resonant tone that drew everyone's attention. "I was a civilian during the Orion Civil War," Call started, his gaze sweeping across the room. "I lived in one of the planets that became a battleground. When the war reached my home, my life changed forever." Call's account was both personal and harrowing. He described the early days of the war when his planet, once a peaceful and prosperous world, became a focal point of conflict. "The Orions were desperate. We were caught in the crossfire of a war that was not ours. The human forces that arrived were relentless, and their aggression was devastating." He detailed the destruction wrought upon his home, the loss of family members, and the suffering inflicted upon civilians. His voice wavered as he recounted how his own family had been torn apart by the violence. "The humans were not the only ones to blame," Call said. "The Orions had their share of cruelty and incompetence. But the human onslaught was brutal, and it left scars that will never heal." The prosecutor, Velayer, seized the opportunity to question Call. "Mr. Call, you've described the suffering caused by the human forces. Do you believe that their actions were justified in the context of the war? Or do you see them as an unwarranted extension of their aggression?" Call's eyes darkened, but he remained composed. "I don't believe the humans were entirely at fault. The war drove both sides to commit atrocities. What I hope to convey is that the violence was devastating, and the long-term impact on the people of my planet was catastrophic. We need to understand the human experience, but also the suffering caused to us." His testimony offered a nuanced view of the conflict, acknowledging both the pain inflicted by humanity and the broader context of the war. It was a reminder that the suffering on both sides was deep and complex, reflecting the broader tragedy of the conflict. As Call concluded his testimony, the courtroom was silent once more. The complexity of the situation was evident, and the council members appeared deep in thought. The emotional weight of Call's account had added a new layer of depth to the trial, challenging both sides to consider the broader implications of their actions. With Call's testimony complete, Judge Thorne announced a recess for the day. The council members withdrew to deliberate, leaving the courtroom in a subdued, contemplative state. Outside the courtroom, Marcus Reed and his defense team gathered for a strategy session. Reed's face was a mixture of determination and concern. "Call's testimony was powerful," he said. "It's crucial that we continue to show that humanity's actions, while severe, were not driven by inherent malice, but by the extremity of the situation." His team nodded in agreement, knowing that their next steps would be critical in shaping the outcome of the trial. They had to present a compelling case not just for the survival of humanity, but for its place in the galaxy as a responsible and cooperative member. In the shadows of the council chamber, General Zara observed the proceedings with a brooding intensity. The testimonies had not only reinforced his frustrations, but also presented new angles to consider. The general knew that the outcome of the trial would have far-reaching consequences, and he was prepared to leverage every piece of information at his disposal to influence the final decision. As the day drew to a close, the focus shifted to the upcoming testimonies. Each side had laid out their arguments, but the final chapter of the trial was yet to unfold. The fate of humanity rested on the delicate balance of justice and empathy, and both sides knew that the final verdict would be a defining moment for the galaxy. The fourth day of the trial dawned with a heavy sense of anticipation. The corridors of the Galactic Council courtroom buzzed with activity as the final testimonies and arguments loomed on the horizon. Marcus Reed, having steeled himself for the impending proceedings, sat at the defense table, flanked by his legal team. They had been preparing meticulously for this moment, knowing it could be the turning point of the trial. Judge Thorne entered the chamber, his imposing presence immediately silencing the room. He took his seat, and the gavel came down with a decisive thud, signaling the beginning of another intense day in court. The focus now shifted to the defense's final witness, a high-ranking official who had played a significant role in the aftermath of the Orion Civil War. The doors to the courtroom opened, and Dr. Elena Vasquez, a renowned diplomat and peacekeeper, stepped into the room. Her arrival was met with a murmur of recognition. Her reputation as a mediator who had worked tirelessly to bring about post-war reconciliation preceded her. Dr. Vasquez took the stand, her expression calm and authoritative. She was sworn in and began her testimony with a voice that carried both warmth and gravity. "I was involved in the negotiations and recovery efforts following the Orion Civil War," she began. "My role was to assist in rebuilding and healing the wounds left by the conflict. What I want to share today is not just about the aftermath of the war, but also about the efforts made to address the suffering on all sides." Her testimony provided a perspective that had been largely absent from the trial so far. She spoke of the international aid efforts, the establishment of reparations programs, and the ongoing work to rebuild the devastated planets. Humanity's involvement in these efforts was not merely a gesture of goodwill, she explained. It was a genuine attempt to make amends for the destruction caused and to foster lasting peace. Dr. Vasquez detailed how various human organizations and governments had invested substantial resources into reconstructing the war-torn regions. She spoke of collaborative projects between humans and Orions to restore infrastructure, provide humanitarian aid, and create educational opportunities for the displaced. These initiatives were not without their challenges, she said. There were setbacks and difficulties, but the commitment to healing was unwavering. The prosecutor, Velayer, stood to question her. "Dr. Vasquez, while the reconstruction efforts you describe are commendable, do they not merely serve to mask the severity of the conflict's impact? Can they truly compensate for the loss and suffering experienced by the Orions?" Dr. Vasquez's response was measured. No amount of aid or rebuilding can undo the pain of war. What these efforts represent is a sincere attempt to rectify the wrongs and build a future where such conflicts do not recur. True reconciliation requires acknowledging the past, addressing the present needs, and working collaboratively towards a shared future. Her testimony provided a crucial counterbalance to the earlier accounts of suffering, presenting a view of humanity as a force capable of genuine redemption and progress. It underscored the complexity of the situation, illustrating that while humanity had indeed caused significant pain, it was also deeply invested in repairing the damage and forging a path forward. As Dr. Vasquez concluded her testimony, the courtroom buzzed with a mixture of respect and contemplation. The evidence of humanity's efforts to make amends added a new dimension to the trial, challenging the council to weigh the entirety of the human experience. Judge Thorne called for a brief recess, allowing the council members to deliberate. In the hallway outside the courtroom, Marcus Reed and his team took a moment to discuss the day's events. Dr. Vasquez's testimony was compelling, Reed said, his tone reflective. It highlighted not just the aftermath of the war, but the ongoing efforts to build a better future. "I believe it will resonate with the council members." His legal team agreed, though they remained cautious. The final arguments were yet to come, and the council's decision would be influenced by the overall impression left by the trial. In the shadows, General Zara watched with a furrowed brow. The trial had revealed layers of complexity he hadn't fully anticipated. While the general remained resolute in his stance, he couldn't ignore the impact of the evidence presented. It was clear that the final verdict would be a delicate balancing act. As the council members returned to the chamber, Judge Thorne prepared to hear the closing arguments. The defense and prosecution would each have one last opportunity to make their case before the council rendered its decision. The weight of the trial's outcome was evident in the tense silence that enveloped the courtroom. Marcus Reed stood ready for his closing statement, fully aware of the gravity of the moment. The future of humanity, its role in the galaxy, and the possibility of a new era of cooperation hinged on the final words spoken in this trial. The council's decision would not only determine the fate of humanity, but also set a precedent for how conflicts and their aftermaths were to be judged in the future. As the chamber lights dimmed and the focus turned to the closing arguments, the galaxy held its breath, waiting for the resolution of a trial that had become a defining moment in its history.